if you've got something in mind, that would be helpful. All right, so first, before I get started, I want to talk about what this presentation is not about. This presentation and the research that I did is not about how vulnerable populations are using or not using technology and data. There's definitely a digital divide. There's definitely a divide that widens when new technology is introduced. People that don't face barriers will have more of an advantage, and that gap takes time to decrease. And that's true of all technology, whether you're talking about mobile phones or cars back in the day. This talk is also not about how organizations and governments are using data and technology for social good. So the focus really is on the individual, and organizations are often facilitating and helping individuals take action, but this really is about what individuals are doing. So for example, volunteering and donating historically would be the main two ways that individuals could help support causes that they care about. Organizations themselves don't do volunteering, but they enable people to volunteer. So likewise, we're looking at the individual actions that people are taking that might be enabled by organizations, but we're focusing on the individual. And so this presentation will cover an overview of the research. I'll tell you what the larger research project was about, because it's not just about technology and data. And I'll provide a few suggestions on how we can increase our impact, whether as individuals or as organizations who work with people that might be interested in taking some of these actions. The final report is in editing stages with the government right now. We're having fights over hyphens. It's awesome. Not fights, I'm joking. But some people care a lot about grammar, which is important. But anyways. So I expect it will be released freely available next week. If you want to get a link when it's done, feel free to leave your email address or a card at the front table, and I'll send you a link when it gets released. I expect next week, but it could be too. Depends on the hyphens. There's a lot of hyphens. Anyways. All right. So another thing before we get started, I want to cover some common language, because not everyone knows what I'm talking about when I talk about some of these actions. Crowdsourced. Crowdsourced often refers to data or other information that's collected from the crowd or the cloud. Basically, people that are out there. You're not going to one person or one expert for a source of information. You are going out to the masses. So Wikipedia would be an example of a crowdsourced tool where people from around the world are contributing and making information better as individual actors. Crowdfunding, very similar. You're not getting funding from one foundation or one donor, but you are accessing small amounts of money from a large number of people. Any questions about crowdsourcing or crowdfunding?
What's the difference between crowdsourced and open source?
Good question. I'll get to that when I talk about open data.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, hackathons. Anyone here ever participated in a hackathon? Couple hands up. Interesting. Ooh. Oh, sorry, I thought I heard someone behind me. Hackathon, that was weird. So hackathons are when groups of people come together, usually over a weekend, in a very intense period of time, often overnight, to tackle problems, usually using technology and data. I'll get to some Canadian examples in a bit, but oftentimes these are people that are tech-related that come to these events, and they're not necessarily focusing on social problems. They could be focusing on developing new products for business or new things that they want to patent. But think lots of people, intense time, brainstorming, and plugging out some sort of product at the end of a weekend. Really intense. Application. An application is basically something that's useful and there's some sort of interaction. So on your mobile phones, if you've ever downloaded an app, that's an application. You could have applications on your phone, applications online, like a map that's interactive, or another website that's interactive. When I talk about applications, that's what I'm talking about. And open data open data is data that's freely available, often is spoken about in reference to government data. So when government freely lets out data, as the municipal government in Vancouver has done, connected to Open Data Day and International Open Data Day, they release information, for example, on garbage pickup routes, which then tech people take and go, hey, what can we do with this? Let's create an application or an app that allows people to get an email when their garbage is going to get picked up the next day. So these are how all of these sorts of words fit together. Open data is freely accessible, often released by government, but not necessarily. Hopefully in a format that's useful. And crowdsourced data is, there's some sort of central point that's collecting a lot of data, and many, many individuals are contributing individual pieces of data. Is that clear-ish? Any other questions about some of this language? For those who this is totally second nature, apologies for the pushing it through. Anybody have a different definition or want to clarify anything I've said?
Just wondering if you answered your question about the difference between crowdsourcing and open.
Yeah, she gave me a bit of a nod. Are you?
Yeah, it's okay. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
I think that's a really good distinction to make, though. Can
Yeah.
you explain that? Can you explain the difference between, what was it, you were
Open
asking about
source.
open source versus open data?
No, she was talking about crowdsourced data and open source
Oh,
data.
versus open source?
Yeah, when we talk about open source, which I won't cover today, that's when people are creating technology where they kind of open the back end to the public for people to build on or use. Yeah.
I thought the question was crowdsourced versus crowdfunding.
No.
No, she asked
Oh,
what's
okay.
open source versus crowdsourced.
Crowdsourced. All right. And I also want to clarify what I mean by vulnerable populations. In this case, with respect to this data, it's people who are at risk for poverty or homelessness because of a myriad of issues. It could be that they're a single parent, that person's a new Canadian or doesn't speak English, who is Aboriginal, someone with mental health or physical disabilities. Really, there was a really broad definition that was used with respect to vulnerable populations. So to back up a step, these are the 4 areas that the research actually covered. So data and technology is actually only one of the 4 areas. I also looked into new forms of consumerism, actions that individuals are taking to buy things from vulnerable populations, from social enterprises, from companies that give to charity. I also looked at ethical consumerism, collaborative consumption. So the sharing economy, are people sharing rides, sharing fruit trees, sharing rooms. So sharing economy was another piece. Investments, I looked into crowdfunding, which we'll talk a little bit about today. I also looked into RRSP eligible term deposits whose money gets deposited or gets used to fund social enterprises. I looked at loan funds, a variety of other investment tools. And then the final category was business owner practices. So I'm not talking about corporate social responsibility. I mean small businesses run by individual people. What practices are they taking with respect to their purchasing and employment policies or standards that could positively impact vulnerable populations? But what we're here today to talk about is the technology and data piece. And so there are 4 areas that I looked into, and the first 3 are quite closely related. So hackathons and collective initiatives. I mentioned hackathons before. This phrase collective initiatives, it's kind of like I think, Eli, did you use the word open source NGO when we talked during the research? Was that Steve?
No, not me.
Okay.
Somebody smarter.
Okay. So collective initiatives, I just mean people that are getting together outside of a company or a formal organization who are just interested in solving social problems through technology. So I see your head nodding. Are you familiar with maybe a group or 2?
Hard to grasp an example.
Yeah. I've got a few Canadian examples, but again, these are both listed in the first bullet, are basically groups of people that are coming together using technology to solve a challenge. The second one, again, people that are developing mobile and web applications, not necessarily as part of a hackathon, the use of open and crowdsourced data, which again tied back to hackathons because often in hackathons people are using open or crowdsourced data. And then the fourth category is digital advocacy. And by that I mean things like social media campaigns and the use of hashtags to share information, and online petitions as well. So these were the categories I was looking into. But there were connections to technology in consumerism and investments as well, because there's technology that exists that helps people make different consumption choices, and there's technology that exists to help people make different investment choices, and that's where crowdfunding fits in. So technology actually plays a role in a lot of the different research areas today. So you may be curious why the government actually funded the study. I was interviewed this morning on Vancouver Co-op Radio, and they were questioning why the government would be interested in advancing more people to take individual action beyond giving and volunteering. So this research was really an extension of research that's already being done in Canada on donations and volunteering. For those of you that work in the not-for-profit sector, you might be familiar with the Canada Survey of Giving, Volunteering, and Participating, which collects data every 3 to 4 years on trends in donating money, participating in civic organizations, and volunteering. And so this is looking at, again, other ways individuals are taking action. They're also interested because the government feels, as I think most of us can agree, that the challenges that our society faces are very, very complex, and it's not very likely that the government or business or the charitable sector or individuals as solo actors are going to actually solve problems. There's got to be more collective action and more people working together, attacking problems from different angles. I just wanted to mention, there is a link down below here. I tried to list all of the interesting initiatives that I came across, the different initiatives that are supporting individuals to take action. Bit.ly.com, it's just a URL shortener, and it's Beyond G&V. Beyond, that stands for Beyond Giving and Volunteering, which is the title of the research project. It hasn't been updated since I finished the project. There's probably some more initiatives to stick in there, but you might be interested to take a look, and you can comment on that document, an example of crowdsourcing some data, and let me know of other initiatives that you come across, because in my research it definitely didn't cover everything and didn't find everything. So the question that brought you here today is, how are individuals using technology and data to support vulnerable populations? And the short answer is, generally, they're not. And there's two caveats to that slight joke. One is that organizations and governments are using data and technology, absolutely. And there are individuals that are participating in hackathons and digital advocacy and crowdfunding projects, but the general awareness around those activities is definitely not as high as giving and volunteering. And when people are taking these actions, they're often not focusing on vulnerable populations. They're often focusing on the environment, or they're focusing on government and vulnerable people, homelessness, poverty. These issues are not being tackled by these sorts of actions. I did want to mention that if you have any questions, feel free to stop me at any time. I tend to talk quickly. It might be hard to get in there, but if you want to stop me, don't feel that you have to wait till the end. So I did want to provide a couple of interesting examples of what's happening in Canada. These are two applications that are in development, they're not finished, that arose from hackathons that happened in Canada. I think one came from, they both came from a hackathon called Hacking Health, which took place in Vancouver earlier this year, but the one on the left came out of the Montreal Hacking Health, and I think the Water Voices one came out of the one in Toronto. But so Water Voices is an application, it's right now just really in the concept phase, is a way for Aboriginal people or people living on reserves to report issues with their water. And understanding that on many reserves there is not internet access, They're trying to figure out ways to use SMS or even through traditional phone lines for people to be able to report information or issues around their water quality, and to let people know, or to let this central point know about boil water advisories or what have you, so that all this crowdsourced data can come in and show a bigger picture as to what's happening with water quality or lack thereof on reserves across Canada, and that information there could be much better shared with decision makers and people in power, because it's shown in a visual format in a way that really resonates with people. But it's, again, the database is growing, but it's not super active yet at this point. The second is Montréal Accessible. Accessible. My French is low, having lived in Spain for 3 months. So what they did is they took a group of developers and they actually went out in the city with people who face physical disabilities, and they tracked the accessibility of every single shop along a 2-block street. It was really powerful because the developers got a chance to have lived experience in a sort of way. They could, without even thinking about their usual day-to-day activities and not realizing where every single step is, when they're alongside someone who uses a wheelchair for mobility, what does it mean to access the average businesses and services that we take for granted? And so they took this information, they plugged it in, they talk about the numbers of doors and ramps and facile de circuler. Oui? What was that? Okay.
I suppose.
The answer is yes. How do you say so? And so they have that information, but it's only for a 2-block section of Montreal right now. I think there might be 2 blocks down here in Montreal and 2 blocks up there, but it's pretty limited at this point. Again, it arose from a hackathon, but at the end of the weekend, it's kind of in a pause state right now. There is some fantastic examples in Vancouver of how data has been used to support vulnerable populations, but they're not necessarily coming from individual actions or hackathons. One great example of the power of data, which I think might have been an unintended consequence, but if it was intended, it was great, was the Vancouver rental database. And so, is anyone not familiar with the Vancouver rental database and the data that got released? Okay. So, the City of Vancouver wanted to open up their information on landlords and their buildings to anyone who wanted to find out about the quality of the accommodations, mostly focusing on if there were any infractions with the city that needed to be taken care of. And so the City of Vancouver let all the landlords know that, hey, you know what, in 6 months or whatever, we're going to make this public. And once the landlords found that out, I believe over 7,000 infractions were taken care of. And so knowing that that data was going public made a huge impact for people who are, or for service providers, for example, nonprofit organizations wanting to help their clients, to be able to find out whether a living situation that they might find themselves in was going to be a safe space or not. So again, there's power in data, but it really hasn't been used by individuals yet that I found in Vancouver. I couldn't find any great examples. There are 3 ongoing hackathons that I know happen in Vancouver. Hacking Health is one of them. Anyone here from Peace Geeks tonight?
He left like 3 days ago. He's on a plane.
Oh, okay.
Sending his apologies over.
So Random Hacks of Kindness is another hackathon organized by Peace Geeks. They have an international focus, though, not necessarily focused on Canada. And then the International Open Data Day and the hackathon associated with that, again, is a hackathon in Vancouver, but the focus is generally on municipal government and not necessarily vulnerable populations. There are collective groups in Canada that are also developing applications. There's actually a group in Quebec that is interested in developing games and learning applications for people with disabilities. I believe the focus is on people that have have vision or hearing challenges. I'm not positive, but
Totally, Montreal co-organizer of the Next Tuesday there.
what was that?
It's the co-organizer of the Next Tuesday.
Oh, okay.
Montreal.
Oh, right. Thomas. Right? Yeah. No, great stuff.
See our people, they're all over.
In terms of digital advocacy, the online petition sites that are used by Canadians aren't based in Canada. Change.org does have a Canadian campaign director, but we don't have any made in Canada models for online advocacy as it relates to online petitions. There have been some really great examples, though, of social media hashtags. Does anyone want to share a hashtag that they're familiar with that was used for advocacy in vulnerable populations, especially if they weren't responsible for actually organizing that campaign? Any hashtags come to mind?
Idle no more.
Idle no more, really great example. What was that? Coney 2012, so it would have been last year. It
A little
was,
bit contentious.
yeah, it came out of the US and had an international focus, but definitely one that spread quite a bit.
Girls Who Code.
Girls Who Code?
Yeah.
So yeah, hashtag, not necessarily focusing on vulnerable populations from a perspective of homelessness or poverty, but from
It's
an issue.
it's Black Girls Who Code is a very vulnerable.
Oh, I thought, well, yes. I didn't realize it was about Black Girls Who Code. I thought it was,
Yeah.
oh, okay, cool. But even so, the focus is not necessarily on, like gender and race equality in the coding sector. Yeah. And not necessarily focusing on any homelessness or poverty issues of that group. But
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the hashtag, so I could be totally wrong. I'm just
I was
guessing.
actually just throwing it out because
Oh.
to see if it was like, if that's like if that's what you're.
Yeah.
And
You know what, I don't know enough to say yes or no.
Moving
But
on.
an example of a hashtag that's stuck in your mind.
Yeah.
There's a hashtag that's mostly focused in Ontario called Op Thunderbird. It's a hashtag that's used as it relates to missing and murdered Aboriginal women from across Canada, and they actually also have an associated open-sourced map where people can report instances of missing or abused or murdered Aboriginal women to, again, help visualize the issue in Canada and to share that information with people who are in positions of power or decision-making ability. Any other?
I wouldn't say it's focused on a vulnerable population, but I do know that an awful lot of concern gets expressed for issues of gentrification on the Vancouver real estate tag, which is VanRE.
Oh, VanRE. So that's a really interesting example of co-opting an existing tag to share a message with people who should become more aware about an issue. That's a really great example. Yeah. And then an example of a YouTube campaign that is beyond Canada, obviously originated in the States with Dan Savage, was the It Gets Better campaign for gay youth. And again, focused largely on, or almost completely on YouTube. Obviously got more media than just YouTube. And then digital advocacy also ends up spreading beyond the digital. Has anyone here ever been to Twestival before? Twestival? No Twestival? So Twestival, it's a Twitter festival, I guess, quite obviously. The last one was held in 2011. 2013 it's back.
Yeah, and in fact, we'll be talking all about that at Net Square Surrey on June 24th.
Right. So Twestival, it's basically a big party for people that use Twitter, and the proceeds go to a charity. In 2011, they went to Beauty Night, and Carolyn McGilvery was there, and she gave a talk. And I mean, it's really just a schmoozing party event with drinks, but it's the Twitterati, and did that come? And all the money goes to a charity for the festival. And then another interesting example, again, beyond Canada, is International Blog Action Day, which usually happens in October, which is basically anyone who blogs is welcome to blog on that day on a topic chosen by the International Blog Action Day Committee. Doesn't necessarily focus on vulnerable populations. I believe last year's focus was water, and so you could do anything related to water and the importance of water in health and security and above and beyond is largely an international focus, but these are all interesting examples of digital advocacy in Canada, but it's, I would say that a lot of it focuses on awareness raising, and unless there's a really healthy offline component, there isn't much more movement than awareness raising. Again, awareness raising is important, but it doesn't necessarily achieve the end goal that the cause is about. Any questions about some of those Canadian examples? All right. Now, I'm going to poo-poo on hackathons for a second. So, in the research, in addition to emailing and speaking with over 100 people, Eli being one of them, about their thoughts and their ideas on who I should talk to and what do they think about some of the research questions, I talked to 20 key informants. And over a third of them were connected to data and technology somehow. And pretty unanimously, they didn't love hackathons. They didn't have much love, and they had quite a few complaints. One was that hackathons often lack focus. So if any of you see yourselves getting involved with a hackathon in the future or want to help organize, these are some things that need to get kept in mind. Hackathons often have a topic like, if we were focusing on vulnerable populations, poverty. And then people would come to the room and just brainstorm like, hey, what should we do with some of this data we can find out there? And there isn't necessarily a focused question, and they may try to be solving a problem that doesn't actually exist. The data, especially when they're released by municipal governments, is really good for real-time action. So when is the bus coming? When is my garbage getting picked up? But not necessarily good for informing social policy, and that's a little bit of a gap right now. Another thing is that participants are often embedded in the tech community. They are not social scientists. They usually don't have lived experience. They have a very different background than the clients that many of the nonprofit organizations in our community are serving. And if the intended audience is a vulnerable person, they are not the end user. And so all of those coming together are not a good blend to have results that have good impact. And then hackathons usually offer little to no support after the event. And by that I mean, applications when they're developed, they require iterations, they require feedback from users, multiple versions come out, and that happens over a period of years. And a hackathon finishes in 48 hours. And so things often die when the weekend's over, which is why you see Water Voices and Montreal Accessible in a bit of a steady state right now. I think they've got great potential, but without that ongoing support, it's really difficult to make a long-term, sustained, deep impact. So hackathons could be better, and these were some of the tips that the thought leaders shared, is when the challenge arises from someone with lived experience, and I mean it could be from a vulnerable person or from a nonprofit organization, frontline worker, who sees a challenge that needs to be addressed and is curious to know, are there other solutions out there? And this could even mean, again, internally within an organization, we have this challenge regarding our donor database. It doesn't necessarily have to be focused on the client, but it could be focused on anything that helps the organization do good work. Hackathons can be better if the data is good and deep. This often requires data from the federal government, which is really tough to get for free in a form that's useful. And so one of the recommendations of the report is to make more data freely accessible. There's something called the National Homeless Information System that many homeless shelters contribute data towards, but the data isn't freely given back, partially out of privacy concerns, but it's right now not in a form that's useful for social scientists and data advocates and people who can create results with that information. It's not accessible to them. Another big issue that could be solved is making or designing hackathons for diverse participation, specifically for the inclusion of people who are those frontline users or frontline workers or vulnerable people themselves. And the this is something obviously that doesn't happen a heck of a lot right now, and it's very difficult to design around because people are often don't make considerations when they don't even know what they don't know is a barrier to other people. And finally, in order for them to be accessible, there needs to be a plan for ongoing support. Often that means funding or dedicated commitment from a high-level volunteer, but there needs to be some sort of ongoing support. So I saw a couple hands that went up when I asked if you had participated in a hackathon before. What's your experience? Is this, yeah?
Well, I think that
So random hacks of kindness?
yeah, that one was a big one. I think the kind of different concept like startup
Startup weekend, okay.
and also the open Amazon.
Yeah.
My I share with you here is generally it's not that good. Like you feel good that in it and you have like awesome weekend and you splash out and you just feel good after you've done it, but it's not really sustainable way of actually doing that.
Yeah.
So I would say that it's just better to a former team say you have a specific topic of problems like that. So and it is just as valuable to share with your common and design. Think about how you can solve this in a year or two.
Yeah.
So you just don't even think about even going to have a code or whatever. Just do the design or just former team over the week. Get out of it.
Yeah, from what I heard about Random Hacks of Kindness, the most successful project was the one that had actually really been thought out before the weekend even started, and so they could really dive into the project.
Yeah.
But just as you said, another use could be just to form around the project and maybe just articulate what the key question is. That takes a lot of time.
I'm still in touch with the team that I was in early Random kind of what is it?
Random Hacks of Kindness?
Random hack of kindness. The reason I'm still in is that the leader who's pitched the idea, he's already in the project. So it was already ongoing project that we jumped in.
Yeah.
And so that I can see that that's not an idea that's being jumped in.
Yeah. So there's a champion to that project who's willing to carry it forward. Yeah. So a lot of the challenges that you mentioned, I'm actually going to touch on because a lot of those came up in all the areas of research that I did. Yeah.
I wonder why the emphasis on a hackathon? Because if you're talking about, I mean, I come from the IT community relations for IT companies and technical user groups, etc. And we don't ask people to sit in a room for 48 hours or 24 hours or 12 hours and code. I mean, you ask for a 6-month or year-long commitment that is, 2 or 3 hours a week where we all hang out, we all hang out on VoIP, or we all hang out and work on a project, and then you have overlap, and then you allow people to move in and move out without losing any of that institutional knowledge, and that's all volunteer. Yeah. And so I just don't. If I wanted people to come and help me, and if I was working with vulnerable populations, this wouldn't be how I do it. Yeah. So.
Yeah, well, one of the things that the research showed from speaking to a variety of individuals was that the activities that drew the most resources, that attracted the most funding, media, volunteers, were not necessarily those that had the best and most sustainable impact. And so this would be a really great example where hackathons are flashy, but they don't necessarily have the staying power to make the change that the people that are attending really want to see. It'd be interesting to hear more about your work that you're talking about, maybe towards the end, once I wrap up comments. Yeah. Yeah.
I get the feeling just because I've been sort of on the edges of a lot of hackathons. I'm a programmer, so I try and sit there and be a good subject matter expert that knows that well.
Yeah.
I just get the feeling that hackathons originate in the idea of programmers getting the chance to get some of their own interests met through the opportunity opportunity to play with data.
Mhm.
So I think the education for people wanting to try a new programming language, try new play around with GIS, those are actually, I think that's actually a really big hackathons, and when especially combine it with, oh, well, there's this data here. And there's very much less emphasis on, well, is our intervention going to be strategic, important way? You know, not to say that that doesn't happen, because the food inspection mapping type advocacy that happens, like sometimes they're, you know, when the person feels like their perspective is sort of general enough that they can be the user and the creator of the tool, but I think it works out well. But I think the mismatch that you mentioned in regards to people not being social scientists or policy analysts who don't have the lived experience is really component to the discussion.
Yeah. So hackathons aren't necessarily the best model, but in terms of individuals who may not before have had interaction with social causes, it's an attractive venue. But they can be done better or differently, or not at all. But it's one path.
Sunny had a question.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, missed you,
I
Sunny.
was just going to share my experience.
Oh yeah, hackathon.
So, I get the idea that sometimes there's not much focus, but I think the team going into the hackathon has a focus that they're going to carry through with it.
Yeah.
Can be very effective. So I did India Hack like half a year ago.
Yeah.
We had an idea and basically went in and like for that 24 hours, honestly, we did something that would have usually taken like a week and a half. And I think that's the kind of energy at a hackathon that it's just like a really focused time where like everyone's really focused and hyper-focused. That environment allows you to be very productive.
Well, it's like you could compare it to, say, a board retreat for an organization.
Yeah.
You spend a day getting together, dealing with some really important strategic issues, but then you need to carry that work on throughout the year. So that would be an apt
So
comparison.
the biggest thing that you're
I wouldn't necessarily say that's a big issue, but it's a really, I think all of these are big issues. Yeah.
I'm just putting that out there, but what if the hackathon was combined with the starter? Like, there would be a selection at the end, and then would then go on to the starter and do all those.
Yeah, there could be a blend. One example out of Calgary called the Calgary App Challenge was focused, or the Charity App Challenge out of Calgary. They had sponsors, and I think about $5,000 went towards funding the ongoing development after the weekend was over. But that would be an example. Yeah. I haven't touched on crowdfunding yet, but did you know that there are over 40 Canadian-based crowdfunding websites that are in various stages of development? 40 in Canada. This comes from, there's a National Crowdfunding Association of Canada, and there are sites for artists, and other creative types, for athletes and individuals looking to raise money, for people that want to raise some tuition money. There's general ones. There's one that are focused on causes. It's not all about vulnerable populations, but it can be. Over 40. And one interesting development that's happening right now, if you work in employment counseling or entrepreneurship with vulnerable people, is the movement towards approving equity-based crowdfunding. And what I mean by that is, for example, right now, if you want to invest in a company and get returns on your investment, if you want to invest in a startup or if you want to invest in a company on the stock market, there are a lot of hoops to jump through in order to make that happen. But some people feel that crowdfunding could be a very interesting model for especially small-scale entrepreneurs to attract money to their business, allow it to grow, and then pay back their investors after time goes on. Right now, the focus on that movement is not on low-income entrepreneurs. And so if you think, and I have a question I don't know the answer to, it is will equity-based crowdfunding be an option for low-income entrepreneurs and people with barriers? I don't know the answer to that, but if you work in employment services or you do entrepreneurship with vulnerable populations, I'd be interested to hear what you think, and so would the Crowdfunding Association of Canada. And right now, Ontario is looking into this, the equity-based crowdfunding model. BC, as far as I know, isn't yet, but both Ontario and Quebec have done some preliminary consultations, public consultations on them. Any first thoughts when I talk about like, equity-based crowdfunding? Yeah.
I think that would actually be a lot better than it's happened some other way.
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah.
and so media website,
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah. I mean, for example, crowdfunding, I could put $10 towards a cause or a creative project, or I could put $10 towards someone's organic delivery business on Vancouver Island. And if I don't get that money back, I'm not going to get crushed, but they might be able to raise enough to buy that used truck. Who knows? But obviously there are, right now the fraud rate in crowdfunding is about 2%, so 2% of projects, and by fraud I'm using the term loosely, it means that projects didn't get finished. And so that will carry on into equity-based crowdfunding as well. But it's in really early stages, but if you work in the employment field in the nonprofit sector and work with vulnerable populations, I really think your voice is important when the equity crowdfunding conversation happens in BC or wherever you are, because the legislation is provincial. All right. I'm just looking at time, and I'm going to kind of flip a little bit. There are 4 challenges that came up in the research, and these touched on all of the areas of the research, including the consumerism and investment. One was the capacity and interest, generally among the nonprofit sector. And I don't mean you because you are here, but both the capacity and the interest in learning tech or funding people in their organization to learn about tech generally was low, according to the people that I spoke to. And if we want to see more people being able to use technology to support vulnerable populations, that's going to need to change. Another issue, the lack of awareness among individuals, very important, because each of us, we choose our media, our media sources for news, and our friends on Facebook and Twitter, and when we see things happening in our circle and within our media sources, we think that the general public knows what's going on, but we're living in what I call a digital echo chamber. We hear our own voices back to us over and over again. And so when we talk about hackathons or vulnerable people or mobile apps, if we talk about any of this sort of stuff, the general public doesn't know what we're talking about. So if we do want this to spread and encourage more people to use their technology and data for social good, we need to actually reach out beyond those who are already involved. And that can involve something as small as going to speak to someone at your organization who perhaps is in a position of power, maybe a VP or a board chair or the CEO, and inviting them to come along to an event like this. I invited a former client here one time, last time I spoke, when we were, where were we?
I think we were at Pole Push or
Full focus.
Yeah, so I met a client, I would say she was probably in her mid-50s, and she felt very out of place there because she felt it was a very young crowd, but she afterwards went up to me and said, it is so amazing that all of these people are here to learn about technology and social good outside of work hours. Like, I had no idea the sort of stuff was going on. And for a young person at an organization who's interested in learning and comes to an event like these, they're doing it on their own time. They're not, getting loo time to come to an event like this. Usually, maybe you work for more progressive organizations, but this learning is important, so it needs to be supported. I mentioned the bottom right-hand corner one before, that the activities that draw interest aren't necessarily the ones that have the greatest impact. So if when we see or want to promote interesting applications of technology and data for social good, let's check ourselves and make sure that we're not just looking for media attention, but we also want sustainable results, which really isn't happening right now. So my three takeaways, and we're not going to have the time to do, I wanted to do a bit of a mini hack, but I don't think we're going to have time today. But one is for the nonprofit and tech folk to know each other, and again, I'm not necessarily talking to people in this room because you're here, but what's frustrating about these two groups is that, I used to work in the nonprofit sector, and when it came to technology, we didn't know what we didn't know. Like, when it came to hiring someone for, say, a website or a content management system or a constituent relationship manager, we didn't know what questions to ask because we just didn't know anything about technology. And likewise, people that are operating in the tech field don't know what they don't know about social issues. And so they might think, hey, like, this would be an interesting challenge to solve. Like, let's work on this project. Not knowing that there are 5 other groups working on that same project, and it would probably be a better use of their time if they, collaborated. And this doesn't happen as much as it should. So I'm hoping that you get to mix and mingle a bit. I'm going to get you to do some funny hand gestures so that you can find people who operate in a different space than you do, so that you can make connections. And I think one of the most powerful connections to make is to find, if you work in the nonprofit sector, find someone who works in the tech field who can be an advisor, a volunteer advisor for you. Not someone who volunteers every week, but who is open to you calling them and say, hey, I have this quick question, can you give me 5 minutes of advice? Or is there a resource I can look at online? Or, what question should I be asking? We're meeting with such and such a person. So you can post for a volunteer opportunity like that on govolunteer.ca or charityvillage.com and see if you can find a tech advisor to give you, an hour of your time or their time once a month. The second interesting suggestion that came from one of the respondents was to try a non-tech hackathon. So if you have a challenge that's actually important you want to solve, technology or data might actually not be the solution. So perhaps get yourself together in a room and have that fun 24-hour event where you're bringing together diverse people and you try to figure out what a solution could be. It might involve tech, but it might not be. It involves getting the right people in the room, but it would actually be a fun volunteer opportunity for maybe some people on your mailing list who are social scientists or who are connected to government policymakers or who do operate in the tech space. So that was a really interesting suggestion. And the third is to not operate in an echo chamber. I mentioned that before. So try to bridge out beyond your comfort zone and your usual sources of information and see if you can make bridges, again, back to number 1, between nonprofit and tech. Does anyone here consider themselves a bridger? Like they feel pretty confident about technology and they operate in the nonprofit space? So a couple of bridgers here. So you are in really powerful positions because you speak both languages. And each language can be confusing for the other team. So those bridgers you've got power and you can use it for good. So do. All right. The activity that I was going to do, and you're welcome to do this on your own time, or you can try this at work, would be if you have a question that you want to figure out how to solve, to start with a question and figure out, one, could we clarify the question? Is it specific enough? So I'm going back to some of the best practices that the research came out of when it came to hackathons, but it doesn't have to be a hackathon, it could be a long-term project. 2, who would we need in the room? So who are the people that are important? And who are some people who think differently but aren't the obvious suspects? So maybe we want an architect, or maybe we want a gardener. So bring together people who think differently than the people that are usually there. What good data or other resources would help us to make a decision or move this challenge forward? Is it possible for participants to have transformational experiential learning regarding whatever the challenge is? So back to the example of the coders going out with people who use wheelchairs for mobility. Is it possible for some pseudo-lived experience to happen without exploitation? And 5, how can we ensure the results live on? So what's the process that's going to take this forward? Who's going to champion it? Where do the resources flow from? And then finally, I do want to emphasize that the people who understand the challenge, they should be a key source of information. So even though the other people in the room are individual experts, often the people who work in the nonprofit sector or people that face barriers are the most likely to keep their voices down. And it's important for the other people in the room to understand the importance to always refer back and check in and ask questions to make sure that the information coming out and that's feeding the work in the room is actually going to help move the project forward. So, again, if you want the full research, feel free to share your card or email address and I'll send it to you hopefully within the next 2 weeks. These are some places to contact me. The slides from today are at this link here. I just uploaded it before and the fonts look really crappy, but you can download it and it does work. And I think